Hello and welcome to another edition of Fired Up. My name's Morgan McClintock, and today I'm joined by Chris Ulbrich. Hey, Chris, how are you?
Doing great. Great to be here.
Today we are talking to Nate Martins, who is the marketing partner at an early stage VC company called Foundation Capital. So we'll be talking a little bit about how to work with your VC, Chris.
That's right. And we'll be getting his perspective on how 2024 has gone from the VC side, what he's looking forward to in 2025, how he's using AI, and maybe get his thoughts on some innovative technologies for startup marketers.
Yeah, I'm interested in diving into that sort of funding announcement process. There was some data announced by Carter recently that 10.7% of all deals closed during December. Obviously, they're negotiated September, October, November, but then they close before the end of the year, and then you've got a gap before they pop up again February onwards. And so for a lot of startups out there, they're going to be closing their rounds around about now, then they need to announce. So this is going to be top of mind for a lot of startups.
The end of the year, it always surprises me that I'm surprised because I always slide into the holidays thinking this year it's going to be pumpkin pie and eggnog, and it's always such a busy time. And that's true on the PR side, but it's definitely true on the deal making side as well.
So that means if you're closing deals right now, you might be able to squeeze it in December, but really you're looking in early 2025. So let's get Nate's opinions about how to make that successful. Nate, great to see you. Welcome to Fired Up. How are you?
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, Chris. Excited to be here. I'm doing great. How are you guys?
Very well, very well. Let's dive in. You're the marketing partner at Foundation Capital, which is an early stage VC firm. Tell us a little bit about your role there.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Foundation Capital is an early stage VC firm. We've been investing in early stage, seed, pre-seed, even Series A for 30 years, just about at this point. And like oftentimes we're the first institutional check for a lot of these companies. And we really invest in mostly technical founders and help them go from zero to $1 million in revenue and oftentimes like far beyond that. We invest with deep conviction in the market, the technology and like the problem our founders are trying to solve. So we can take a hands-on approach to solving that together. And I think marketing is really an extension of that. For us, kind of falls into two buckets. So the first being how can we build brand for the firm and for our individual partners. When I talk to a lot of the founders who we've invested in, a lot of them have really close relationships with the GPs and the rest of the investing team. So we want to really like elevate them, elevate their profiles. So that's like a big bucket of work for us is really brand building. We create programs and content for the companies that we work with, and obviously share that more broadly as well. Then the other bucket is like a little more traditional portfolio support. So that can be PR, which I'm sure we'll talk about here. From a marketing perspective, it'll be things like brand, messaging work, but even as like a firm being super hands-on, one of the first things we do is help our founders get their first customers. And so we have a network to help with that of Fortune 500 CEOs who we'll connect them with, and then also help them like build their team. So the portfolio support isn't just marketing. It'll be a lot of other things that these super early founders find valuable. Yeah, two big buckets, but a lot of work within those buckets for sure.
So there's building the Foundation Capital brand and supporting the partners. Then there's working with the portfolio companies. So if I'm a startup marketer, what are the kinds of things that I can come to my VC firm for?
Yeah, it's a good question. And a lot of times it ends up being PR, honestly. That is one of the first things that I get asked about when I engage with some of these founders. I think about like why that is. And I think it's just because it's having worked with technical founders a lot, they just don't know some of these GTM like motions. And I think PR is one that is actually far less clear than even, for example, like sales or some of the more like traditional like types of marketing that you can do. I'm preaching to the choir here, but you guys know it's difficult. It is constantly changing. So PR tends to be one of the first ones. Also, like because we invest so early, some of the companies will be coming out of stealth. And so that's a large moment. They'll be announcing like a seed round or something like that. PR plays a huge role in that. Messaging is also another common one. Again, equally hard to pin down and even less like data driven maybe than something like PR. It's like, how do you tell what is a good message or one that resonates versus not, especially so early on? And I think working with them to ideate, to workshop messaging, and then really how do these things come to life across the different channels? So I've worked with founders on that. And then sometimes too, it's how do we help them raise follow-on capital? Again, because we're investing so early, we'll work with them on a deck for their Series A. And so messaging is part of that. There will be like visuals. There's actually like the asset of the pitch deck. So that's like the three things that I mostly see. I was thinking about this question and I was wondering like what I wished founders came to me more for. And I think it's like partner marketing. So I think the earliest that we can engage with a founder, the better. And like our goals are aligned here, I would say. And again, being a firm that's pretty hands-on, I'd love to work to help establish that message with our founders a little more. Maybe it's just something they don't think about a ton, but just to collaborate more with firms is something I would like to try to do more with our founders. And I'm sure other marketers would too.
So in the spirit of that sort of collaboration, you talk about messaging, like, okay, you've written the check. Clearly that's a moment that they want to announce. And we'll talk about the actual sort of funding announcement in a moment. But on the messaging side, what is the actual process there? How hands-on will you be? Will you actually be running like the messaging workshop and providing the sort of message house template and guiding them through it? Or will you just be showing examples of what other companies have done and say, showing them the direction, but not actually doing it for them?
Yeah, the honest answer is probably somewhere in the middle. I've engaged both ways, and I think it depends on like the founder too and their appetite to do these types of things and their like knowledge of messaging and marketing in general. I think it's helpful for us to like ideate at the earliest stages because like it can really help from a trickle down perspective once we actually create assets and things that like, yeah, they're aligned. And then they're also, it's like, are we saying something like unique here? Because I'd be working with the founder to ask questions like, what is unique about your technology? Who are your competitors? How do you plan to acquire customers? Like things like that that are crucial to like every aspect of the messaging that like trickles down. So ideally early, and then I've heard of like a W from like a planning process before, so it'll go up and down. And the engagement can be like that, where it's like, we'll start at the top. Hey, let's go through like this messaging workshop. Then you take that, you meaning the founder, and like hone and tighten this. Then it comes back up, and maybe we, to your point, have a brand pyramid, and then it goes back down. So like that's, I think, the best way to engage because the best stuff is going to come from the founder. They know all of this, and maybe it's my job to help them pull it out and codify it. But that's my preferred engagement because like the stuff I say, I'm not going to know. People are going to see through. It's just like marketing lingo.
I often wonder, an early stage startup, in order to get funding in the first place, has to have its messaging organized to some degree. If it's possible to generalize, what do you find is most commonly like the next step that startups need to take? What's missing from their messaging once they've received funding, but they need to actually put it to work?
From what I have seen, a lot of it is like how that messaging comes to life across like different channels. So one thing I'll talk to founders about is voice first tone. And you, for example, know the sound of your mom's voice. It's consistent. It's always the same, but the tone will change if she's like angry or if she's happy or something like that. And maybe, she'll throw in your middle name too or something. But I think it's kind of like, hey, how do I say this if I'm writing like an email to somebody? How do I say this on my website? And so I think that is like the next step in terms of like, how do I make my marketing like real? The messaging is good, but nobody's going to see, or very few people are going to see the messaging that's in like the pitch deck or something like that. And that's all important and resonant, but there's a difficulty and a difference, like hey, slapping it on the front page of your website that I think tends to be the hardest part. I've seen that from founders at the early stage, even founders at the later stage too.
Yeah, that's very common. Or you write it in the messaging doc, and then when you put it onto the website, does it look right? And then they use that messaging in a sales pitch. I just wouldn't use this frame of words. And I like your sort of, like, it's actually the tone. I want to try and get across the same information, but these are different. We're going to use slightly different words because it's contextual to the format.
I think what's interesting too is like you understand the tone, but then also understand like the channel too, and what you hope to cultivate with that channel. For example, your social can probably be a little sillier than maybe your sales prospectus emails or something like that. I'm sure you all see this like all the time from like a PR perspective in terms of having a message hitting it like a bunch for sure, but also what is like the press angle of this too, right?
What I'm hearing is lean in early. I like the W, sort of get that help and sort of be set on your right course, get the messaging. You're going to be doing some PR around the funding, which we'll talk about. Is there anything that's sort of outside that, though, that it's not I don't want to say unreasonable to ask, but is there anything that's outside that normal relationship at the beginning that a startup can ask?
Maybe like other firms, but I think really like we're super hands-on. So I think ask, and the worst that we can say is no. But I guess some stuff that is a little more like difficult for me to do is the stuff that's really in the weeds. For example, can you help me like write this email? The other one too is, can you get me into this like event or something like that? That can be a little harder too. But from a marketing perspective, yeah, I would encourage like, and I think our founders feel this too, but to come to us and let's like work. We want to be as helpful as possible. I know that's like the VC like cliche, right? Like how can I like add value? But it's something that we actually do not take lightly. So yeah, that's our MO.
I would really be curious to hear more about what you said about events there, because that does come up a lot. And there is an assumption that VC firms have superpowers in that regard, and they may very well. But from your perspective, how far do those powers exist, and when can you deploy them? How can you deploy them? What are the limits?
Yeah, it probably depends on the like event, I would say. If it's, maybe a larger one, it's easier. If it's a little more exclusive, it's probably difficult. Depends on our like relationship with who's throwing it. But yeah, again, like I just say ask and we'll give it a shot, but you only have so many favors, I think, to a certain degree. And like, do we want to burn one here? Not that it's like that complicated necessarily, but how can we create the most like impact for our founders and like the partnership? And if we decide it's here, like, sure, let's go full force, but it'll depend on the situation a little bit.
That's a nice segue to the next question, which is about how you work with your portfolio companies on funding, that being one of the most intense and fraught moments when a firm can be interacting with a company, with a startup. And obviously at that point, you might also be working with one or more PR agencies. Could you just give me an overview of how you approach funding with your portfolio companies?
Yeah, I think there's two elements of the engagement. The first one is getting all of our ducks in a row, basically. So I think early on, we'll want to decide if oftentimes we'll bring in either like an individual PR freelancer or like a firm. And we have a Rolodex of highly trusted folks who we work with, and we will engage early with the founder and connect them with these people. There are times when we might lean in a little more, times when we might not. But generally speaking, I would say it's mostly we'll bring in our trusted expert in PR. And then it's at that moment, then we get those ducks in a row. Are we doing an exclusive? Are we doing an embargo? Do you need a quote from us? Can we help produce the press release? And in my experience, we are often not the ones driving the funding announcement, but we are like involved throughout in terms of providing feedback and helping like shape some of the messaging like I was talking about before. And then the other one is like how we amplify it. This is super important. As I mentioned earlier, our goals are aligned here. We want to help you get as much like press as you possibly can for this funding announcement. I kind of have a philosophy in terms of like our own internal approach to this is, what's the story you're not going to read in TechCrunch? You have obviously all of the important funding details in there, and we want to make sure we amplify those and get those across. But I think about it more from a human level, honestly. How did we engage? Like, how did we first meet? What were some of the hard moments here? And I think that's especially resonant for Foundation Capital as a firm because we work with founders so early. I mean, so many times we incubate a company and we engage before there's any product, before there's any revenue, especially. And so early on, it can be like, hey, we're just throwing ideas back at each other and identifying like the market, what's the problem space, things like that. And so I really want to get those across because that's some of the unique aspects of the story that only we can tell. We do that together with our founders and companies, but I do think it adds a nice element to some of those harder numbers and facts that you might get from a more like editorial story.
And I would guess that in many cases, given the size of the companies you're working with and the stage of the companies, that this is the first time they've had a chance to tell their story to the media, through the media. In some ways, it makes sense. You'd be thinking about their story really holistically because it's the first time any of it has been presented and you want to put forward a fully rounded story. to pave the way for more coverage in the future. You're trying to talk about who these founders are, what their vision is. It's not a check-in on this company. You're introducing the company for the first time.
Yeah. And like you said, there's so many important parts of that, like an introduction. The check is just the handshake, but it's, I don't know, maybe how you dress, how you hold yourself, what do you talk about? Like all of these things that are important, like when you step into the room, so to speak. We definitely like to provide as much support as we can as part of that introduction, try to carve out something unique to us. But yeah, at the end of the day, it kind of comes down to like our goals are the same as those of our company and really being like aligned and like high touch throughout that whole introduction process.
A lot of these founders, I would imagine this is their first time working with media. What do you think is the most important thing for them to keep in mind when working through this marketing channel for the first time?
This is maybe blunt, but like make people care. Yeah, like a lot of the time, like we'll work with founders and they've been so heads down on their product and the technology, and it's truly like amazing. We wouldn't invest if we didn't think that. But take one or maybe two or three steps back, and there's so much happening in the space. There's a lot of funding announcements that happen. I think the bar, even from a monetary standpoint, has gotten like much, much higher on coverage for those. So I think it's like, how can you really make somebody, and this is not even just for like PR, I think it's resonant PR, but potential customers, things like that. Like, how do you make people care? Sometimes founders will come into it thinking like, oh, people are just going to care because the technology is like super cool. I wish that was the case, but oftentimes it is not. So it's like the question I find myself asking most is who cares and like why? And let's really tap into that as part of this engagement.
My guess is most reporters would agree with that. I know the famously veteran tech reporter said of startups, your story is boring until proven otherwise. I often think of that in engaging with a new client, how to get over that skepticism. On that note, we talked just now about rules of thumb and best practices, but this tech is constantly ebbing and flowing and changing. And what have you been seeing over the past 12 months about the landscape for funding, especially in this much publicized pullback in the SaaS industry? Are you seeing any changes in the way that companies approach the media and the way the media approach them?
I kind of alluded to this, but like I think the bar just being much higher in terms of things like the size of the round. I forget which publication it was, but it's, hey, we're not going to round anything that's less than like a $20 million round or something like that. So I've seen that. And maybe that's, a little less resonant over the last like year. And if we go back to like pandemic era times when the money was just like flowing, maybe it's a little more resonant then. But the other point too is like, what is the larger story here again that make me care? And the third, I think I'll say is, especially in the SaaS industry, a lot of people just like tack on AI. What we are seeing is reporters actually like pushing on what that means a little more. Is it like AI native? Is it just some chat GPT like wrapper? And there's just more like knowledge about the value that AI can give to potential customers for these companies. Reporters understand that and they are asking the right questions in terms of the technology.
The bar has been set higher. One of the perennial just tactical questions that PR teams deal with when executing a funding announcement is when you get started. What's your take on that? When should you get the ball rolling with getting your messaging together, getting the press release together? And at what point do you want to be, as the firm, pulled into the process?
Like as early as possible, I would say, or as early as you think is useful. I don't think that you should just announce just because necessarily. But if you, for example, you're coming out of stealth, that's obviously a big moment. And I always think like, how can we attach this funding news to something? Are you announcing like a key hire? Is there a large update to your product? And there's a little more of a time-bound urgency to it. I'd say that's a good starting point to create a work back plan, basically. You all can probably tell me actually like how long pitching takes these days. A month, maybe?
We certainly have thoughts on that. As often, it depends on the segment and the reporter and the company, of course. But a month is, especially if you're doing an exclusive, that's by no means out of the question. And that's typically where we start now. That's on the theory that you might need to give a reporter a couple days just to check with an editor, confirm, take the pitch on board. And obviously, you're not pitching that to multiple reporters at once because it's an exclusive. So It might take you a week to go through 2 or 3 people, depending on how hard you're pushing them. Now you are at 3 weeks if you haven't found a home for that exclusive. And you always have to have in the back pocket the possibility that you're just not going to find someone to take the exclusive and you're going to have to pitch it under embargo. And you're going to need 2 weeks for that because you need to leave time for interviews. In reality, 2 weeks before the news goes out is more like a week and a half, because you need to leave some time for back and forth and revisions and interviews and so on. I think a month makes a lot of sense. That said, I do find that reporters tend to click in, if it's an embargo, they tend to click in at about 2 weeks, and especially at 1 week. But 2 week is where you get the most signal back from an embargo pitch. Obviously, with an exclusive, you're having a totally different conversation. You can engage a lot earlier, but I would not prefer to start pitching any later than 3 weeks out.
That's kind of how I operate generally. I'll say about a month, just because I'm nervous and conservative. So I'll just bake in the extra time. You mentioned all these factors, which I think are super important, but like even extrapolate those out in terms of like our engagement. Do they have messaging? Have they worked on this before? Maybe it's a new company, but maybe they've had a successful exit previously and kind of know how the playbook works. And so it can be anything from, hey, we are at like ground zero here, let's create the messaging. And maybe that means we're engaging 2 months ahead of like a planned announcement, like maybe even more, all the way to like, hey, we have a lot of stuff. We actually even pulled in our own PR firm. We have the release. Like, can you just provide feedback on it? And, that could be like 2 weeks or something like that.
Yeah. And to be clear, I'm just talking about the pitch process. Typically, we'll have had 2 or 3 weeks ahead of that to get the materials together. So ideally, we're not starting pitching until messaging is set, the VCs are aligned, everyone is given the thumbs up, and that can take a few weeks for sure. A month and a half to 2 months for the entire process is hardly too long in the landscape as it is today.
I thought PR is easy. Don't you just pitch? And then,
right.
Then that's it?
Yeah, and that surprises a lot of startups, right? Coming in, you've got no messaging. Often there's no website. You've got to build a website. Even if you've got a website, you've got to have some assets to download and things for people to do on the website, some extra blog posts. Like when you do the work back plan with all this, people are, okay, yeah, this is actually a lot. And of course, they're often trying to close the funding during that process, which means they're busy. And they're also trying to sell. The timing is often longer than you'd think. Now, it can be done in a short period of time because this can suggest that, we all want weeks, and you can turn things around quickly, but you only get one chance to launch your company or do one of these funding announcements. So set yourself up for success and try not to compress the timeline, because then your chances of a successful outcome are more limited. So we talked a little bit about how obviously the funding announcement is a critical part of when a marketer might work with their VC firm. But how else do you support the portfolio companies outside of the funding thing when it comes to PR?
The funding announcements tend to be the largest ones, I would say. And I think these smaller moments, like we just tend to help amplify them. And I think if they hit like whatever we and the founders deem to be kind of this critical mass, essentially, of like our partnership, then we will engage. So if they're like acquiring a company, for example, like, okay, let's, maybe lean in more because this moment is larger than if they just announce like a product feature or something like that. So we have to play it by ear in terms of the value of our engagement with that company. But a lot of it is honestly like using our own channels to amplify their stories as much as possible. And then again, if we hit that like critical mass, hey, maybe we do more of the partnership marketing that I was discussing. It's like, can we produce a story about this? Maybe, for example, like video, I think is like huge. So are we going to produce some like video together? But it all comes down to like outside of funding announcements, do we reach this? I keep saying critical mass, but like, do we kind of reach that point in terms of deciding like our engagement's actually helpful?
Yeah, I mean, you just touched on a great point, and that often the portfolio companies looking to the VC to support them, but also they can help you with your raising the profile of the company and the partners. What are some of the ways that they can reciprocate?
Maybe this is a silly answer, but just like doing good work. I think that's
just be successful and we'll all be happy.
That is the easiest, but I would say that the partnership and the willingness to partner is huge. A lot of my work marketing like the firm and like the partners, if we are able to work with our portfolio companies to like do that. Like social proof is just such an important part of any marketing strategy, let alone a VC marketing strategy where relationships, word of mouth, there's like less data. It just matters a ton. And so I'd say the number one thing is just like willingness. We at Foundation have put a lot of work into building up those channels, and I hope it's mutually beneficial. Like that is always the goal. I'm not going to say, hey, you just help me because it's going to help me increase my numbers or something like that. Like we want to help build your and your company's profiles here too. I do hope it's an engagement where we can help each other. Let's start from a place of willingness to do that.
Just in a sort of a practical sense, how often are you talking to the portfolio companies? Is there a standing meeting? Is this once a week? You described it as a W, so I'm guessing it varies, but what does that typical engagement look like?
Often it'll be like when they need us for the most part. And as I mentioned, we tend to take a pretty high touch approach, and like marketing and even more specifically like PR, they're going to want to engage in specific moments essentially. So no like standing meetings or anything like that. The line is always open. And so I'll get questions from founders about, for example, I have a lot of experience in content marketing. So they'll say, hey, can we talk about your building a content marketing strategy? And if we think that's like useful for the business, sure. And we'll hop on a call and do that. But it's mostly like a door always open policy. And then if we decide like, hey, there's something big coming and you all need help, then we're always here.
On that note, I'm guessing that because you're working with such early stage companies, they're looking to you a lot of the time for advice about not only how to do what they know they want to do, but what they ought to be doing that they haven't even thought of. So, looking out ahead, we're getting close to the end of 2024. What trends are you looking at in marketing and maybe advising your portfolio companies about and suggesting maybe they want to dip their toe in?
Yeah, and it's going to be unique for every company probably because like the way that I engage most often is a first understanding of like how they acquire their customers. And then I think like the marketing strategy will be tailored to that. But more broadly speaking, it's just like video. That from the marketing perspective is I think just so important. Like one thing I see right now is like on LinkedIn, for example, is turning into a vertical video platform. You can see in terms of the suggestions, we've obviously are experimenting and learning here as part of this process as well. But the importance of video is like the highest value asset that you can actually capture. And the reason for that is because if we create a video, let's just say the video sucks, the quality's bad or something, we still have the audio and we can use that. And let's say the audio quality sucks. Like we still have the transcript and we can turn it into a piece of content. And not only that, like we can take the video, chop it up and redistribute it a bunch of different ways. So I think there's two kind of like reasons why I think video is so powerful, just because it's a valuable piece of like content from a platform standpoint, but also from a repackaging and repurposability standpoint as well. I get questions about SEO as well. I just don't know where it's headed. I have like theories, but with the impact of AI, I just wonder like how valuable SEO as a marketing channel is going to be. There's like the meta questions like, hey, are people going to be like Googling things less with a tool like Perplexity or something? Like I find myself doing that. Like I probably Google far less than I did a year ago, let's say. But even once you're actually on Google as a platform, look at the AI suggestion or the response that it gives you is the top 3 position, which is the holy grail in SEO for the past however many years. Are people going to scroll past the AI suggestion anymore? Are 2 and 3 even valuable? I don't know. And I think people want the information faster and more directly. They don't want to have to sift for it. So I get questions about SEO too. And that is one where I'm like, I don't know if it's worth the investment just because of like AI changing that, to be frank.
Right. And then there's that whole other twist about AIs building in web search into their, or ChatGPT building in web search into their responses. And you can force it or you can let it decide whether to run it. But we're certainly seeing in just our own internal work that more and more, even if you tell ChatGPT not to do a web search, it will decide sometimes to do it anyway. And then, of course, when it does the web search, it can cite sources. And at that point, it really is presenting links to the end user that could conceivably drive traffic to their blog post or so on. I know that content that we've created is showing up in ChatGPT. So it does raise the possibility that SEO is going to need to evolve Or it seems that way. The SEO is going to need to evolve to a world where you're still getting presented with links, but it's being intermediated through something like ChatGPT or Perplexity. And maybe it's going to be more of an evolution, but it's certainly something we're keeping an eye on.
It's so just pervasive, like everywhere. And I think that one additional point I would add is that AI kind of like enables everybody to be like a content creator. And this is obviously text is one way to do that. More and more it's images, it's like video as well. How can you as a founder, or like maybe even more specifically a marketer, develop your brand in a way that feels unique, and also develop your taste and the discernment of what is good versus what is bad in a world where just about everybody can produce this content is actually going to be like what rises to the top, maybe even more than it used to. The ability for everybody to create these things is like awesome. It's great. The barrier to entry is like so low, but like the flip side of that is like you're going to have to do more work to stand out, and you're going to have to hit that message a lot harder. You're going to have to decide what is good, what is not good here. Where's our bar sit? And there's no answer to that besides just doing it over and over again, trying it. But that is something that I'm like thinking about front of mind from a marketing perspective as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so when you say video, it sounded like the example that you were thinking about was a video, like a customer case study interview where you get a video. You could either get the whole video and you could chop that up, or you get the transcript or the audio, compared to a 60-second sizzle reel that they might put on their homepage or something. Is that the kind of format that you're thinking of, or are you thinking about advising founders to maybe they should start their own video podcast or do a video series? What's the format?
I'm not going to take credit for this idea. My former boss at marketing, Camille Riggets, the head of marketing, and she started the First 100 Review, just really amazing person. She has talked about the value of seeing someone's face and the delivering a message or a story through like a face. I think that in a world where so much is becoming like digitized, even, you have like fake AI characters and stuff, that feels more powerful. So yeah, Morgan, to more directly answer your question, I am thinking of these like testimonial videos. And it can even be something like and we used to do this at Notion too, like akin to like a Loom of, hey, here's our new product that we're announcing. Let me walk you through it and why I'm excited about it. And it can be a split screen or something like that. That to me just feels stronger than a video you might whip up on like Sora, or even just showing the product like itself. There's just such a human element to storytelling here.
Yeah, and very cheap and very easy to do. There's a low barrier to entry to doing a Loom walkthrough of your new feature or a quick, interview with a customer.
That might even be a better way to go, where that is more like thumb stopping than something that is like super highly produced. Like that lo-fi feeling like might actually stop you in your tracks more than like the hyper polished AI video or something.
Yeah, definitely. And we often see that, for companies with an open source motion or targeting developers, where they're after the information, they're not after the production. Anything that looks too overproduced, actually, people could bounce off that. I'm with you on that. And you'll get better at the production. You've got to just start. So just as we wrap this section, any final advice that you are giving to the marketers at your portfolio companies?
Early on, for marketers at these young companies, my thought is always to get something out at 80%, and learning from it and iterating on it is usually better than waiting to get it out at 100%. A startup's biggest advantage, in my opinion, and this is not a unique take, is its speed. As a marketer, the iteration process is even more important in terms of like, how do you learn? What is the data that you can acquire? How do you use that data in terms of making decisions? It is just so important. So my advice is always, hey, work quickly to get it out. Have whatever your 80% bar is, make sure it hits a quality bar for you. And I'm not saying like do something bad or do something crappy, but get it out quickly and learn and iterate.
Good advice, because something that's not actually published and out there and you're still noodling on is not going to gain traction with your audience. And it's best to get it out there. You can always go back and refine it and get better and improve it if it's getting traction, but get the traction. So Nate Martins is the marketing partner at early stage VC company Foundation Capital. Nate, thanks so much for your time today. If people want to get in touch with you, where should they go?
Yeah, I really appreciate the time today, guys. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Great stuff. All right, Nate. Thanks for your time today. Really enjoyed the conversation, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, Chris.